This week on The Impact, new Commissioner of Public Lands Dave Upthegrove weighs in on his plans for the Department of Natural Resources and the recently announced pause on certain timber sales.
We have a responsibility under the Federal Endangered Species Act. We also have a responsibility to the next generation.
We will cover the stakes for trust beneficiaries and the environment.
My vision is to maintain our current sustainable harvest calculation levels. I'm talking about making some changes to the schedule of when we harvest certain parcels.
Plus, a look at his perspective on wildfire, recreation, and agency funding. That's all coming up on The Impact. Wildfire response, tied lands, recreation on state lands, and timber sales for trust beneficiaries all fall under the State Department of Natural Resources. And starting this month, there's a change at the top. New Commissioner of Public Lands Dave Upthegrove announced a big change immediately upon taking over the State Department of Natural Resources. Hello and welcome to The Impact. I'm Mike McClanahan. On day one, Upthegrove announced a pause on timber sales involving certain older state forests that are structurally complex. The debate over what are sometimes referred to as legacy forests was a big campaign issue last year. Even the term can be controversial. It generally refers to trees under 120 years old in areas that haven't been logged since World War II. Some environmental groups are hailing the decision. Rachel Baker of Washington Conservation Action said in a statement, Commissioner Upthegrove is taking immediate action to resolve a persistent, intractable issue. This allows DNR to strike the right balance between public values and timber harvest, and between meeting commitments to agency policy and climate change and commitments to communities. The pause is drawing mixed reactions from some other stakeholders. Nick Smith from the American Forest Resource Council issued a statement saying, "We look forward to working with Commissioner Upthegrove on the sustainable management of DNR state trust lands which provide timber, recreation, clean air and water, and healthy wildlife habitat. We are indeed curious about his 6-month pause and how that could negatively impact Washington schools, fire districts, libraries, rural hospitals, and other beneficiaries that sorely depend on DNR timber revenues." For more on that and other topics that fall into the realm of DNR, joining me now, Commissioner of Public Lands, Dave Upthegrove. Thank you very much for your time. If you could let's start with the recently announced pause on the sale of timber in some of the older state forests. Tell us what's going on and walk me through the rationale.
Well, first, it's great to be back on your program, Mike. And just less than a week ago, I raised my hand and was sworn in as the 15th Commissioner of Public Lands and set 3 big picture priorities: protect our clean air, water, and habitat, improve wildfire prevention and response, and to increase recreational opportunities on our state lands. And that first one I mentioned, protecting clean air, water, and habitat, is something near and dear to my heart. And in the campaign, I made a commitment to do better at managing and protecting the habitat so we have sustainable forestry for generations to come. And as part of that commitment, I announced on my first day in office that we're going to take a pause on the harvesting of certain structurally complex mature forests. You know, I used to work as a basketball referee, and I know very well when a timeout is needed. And so we're taking a short timeout to get a little bit of work done. Number one, we're going to use the best technology in the world to get a better picture of what forests we have where, what types of forests across the landscape. And secondly, we're going to work with counties and environmental groups and the industry and anyone interested on identifying the criteria of the forests that we want to make sure we're deferring to meet our habitat goals. The important thing I want to note is I'm not proposing we set aside permanently in preservation certain forests. I'm talking about changing the scheduling of our harvests so that we ensure that across the landscape we have younger forests, medium forests, and older forests, because that's what our habitat plans call for in order to make sure we're sustaining our environment along with our economy. I envision a strong, healthy wood products industry and value the important role this agency plays in supporting our counties and our schools. And I believe with some modest changes, working collaboratively, we can do that in ways that are better for our habitat.
At this point, do you know how many acres of state forests we're talking about? What are the projections?
That's the first step in the process. That's what I'm talking about. We have some modeling that, and new technology, both LiDAR data and spatial data, that's going to give us a really good picture of what types of forests exist. As you can imagine, that's tricky to know without sending someone out on the ground over the entire state of Washington. But the first step in this process is getting a handle on what is our current acreage. And then we will determine the criteria of which of those forests are valuable for that habitat.
How will this impact the revenue for the trust beneficiaries, schools, particularly in rural areas? The funding from trust land and primarily timber sales goes towards school construction, which has been an ongoing need in those areas that have trouble passing bonds especially. Is there a plan to replace that revenue? Or will it need to be replaced?
Yep. The department plays a critical role in providing funding for, as you noted, counties and the jurisdictions within them. We also provide some funding for school construction and for our universities. In the long term, this can be done in a way that sustains that funding. As I envision moving from harvesting one set of timber parcels to another, it'll take some time for us to tee up those other timber sales. So there likely would be a one-time delay in some payments to some counties. We're not talking about anything that affects this year's budget in a significant way. You know, if we sold a parcel of timber this year, the county it was in would get some money in a couple years when the wood is cut. If we're pausing that sale and we tee up a different sale in that county, there'd be a delay in when that county gets the funding. I'm very committed to working with our county partners and other jurisdictions on long-term solutions for funding. We have a program called the Encumbered Lands Program designed to help mitigate endangered species set-asides. I want to see the legislature fully fund that program so counties get those funds. You know, the Department of Natural Resources is an important partner, but the fiscal challenges facing counties and schools, the scope of that goes well beyond the Department of Natural Resources. The solution to school funding, the solution to local government funding isn't going to be found at DNR. It's going to be found in us working in partnership with the legislature to secure that kind of dedicated funding.
But the trust land revenue is significant in terms of how it impacts beneficiaries those with smaller tax bases especially, it seems, are more reliant on those. There have been discussions in the past under, well, just from various legislators and from various statewide electeds about alternative ways of using state lands to produce revenue. Do you have any ideas or thoughts about that?
Sure, I think there are ways we can supplement our existing work. There's a pilot project underway to try to capture carbon credits and value for the carbon stored in forests, and I'm supportive of continuing that pilot project. In other states where they have carbon markets, there have been opportunities to receive carbon credits for improved forest management techniques. If we're doing things better in ways that are better for the climate, we can get credit for that in some markets. So I think there's some opportunities to try to monetize some of those other benefits that forests provide. Right now it's pennies on the dollar. The primary revenue source from our forest lands are through wood products and timber harvest, but certainly I think everyone's long-term vision would be to find ways to monetize those other values. Forests are valuable for so much more than just generating money. They provide flood protection, they provide habitat, they provide recreation, they provide spiritual values to people. And I think harmonizing our responsibilities to the trust beneficiaries with our responsibilities to the public is the cornerstone challenge of this job.
Do you envision a future where there's less timber revenue or less logging in state lands?
My vision is to maintain our current sustainable harvest calculation levels. I'm talking about making some changes to the schedule of when we harvest certain parcels. And so I believe that by deferring for the time being the harvest of this small subset of structurally complex mature forests, we can meet that diversity across the landscape. So I believe we can have a strong, healthy forest practices industry, and we can support rural economies and do better at meeting our habitat goals through changes in where we're prioritizing those harvests.
Have you had any feedback from various stakeholders at this point about the change?
I'm just getting out to talk to folks. The idea and concepts were debated during the political campaign, and lots of people had lots of thoughts. Political campaigns are designed to inflame differences. My job now is the opposite. It's to bring people together. And so one of my first meetings is with the Washington Association of Counties, my very first stakeholder meeting. They have a great interest in this. And I'm interested in partnering with these kinds of organizations to figure out the best way to implement this so that we can find strategies and tools that meet their interests. So I'm very excited to meet with all of the parties involved. That's why we're taking this pause approach and not just diving right into something, because I want to hear from, listen to, and work with impacted stakeholders, whether that be industry, whether it be local governments, whether it be Washington State's tribes, the Board of Natural Resources, and the legislature. I think we can have a little bit of a reset if we do this thoughtfully and we do it together. And the value of that, if we can get beyond the lawsuits, we can have some sustainable, predictable harvest levels where everyone benefits.
So do you anticipate lawsuits, or are there already?
I would hope not. There's nothing we're doing that is in violation of the law. We're simply prioritizing other parcels for harvest.
Have you had any discussion with the legislature about this proposal since they're in session? Granted, you're very new, but given that sort of it's out there.
With individual legislators and leadership, and the feedback has been positive.
In terms of, if we could change tracks for a bit here, wildfire has been, well, it's a key issue, and it's one of the things that when we think wildfire, we think DNR, because you're the lead state wildfire fighting agency. And so when state lands are involved, DNR is out there. We sort of got a reprieve last year, and I think it wasn't quite as bad the year before, but we're coming off of a couple of decades of really bad big fires. How do you envision wildfire response in Washington? Are you just continue bolster resources, or do you have any other? Is there anything different about your approach to wildfire that viewers should know about?
Short answer is no. This department is on the right track when it comes to wildfire prevention and response, thanks to investments from the legislature. We are really leading the nation with cutting-edge technology in detection and prevention. What's going to be important, however, is to maintain those investments in prevention. You only need to turn on the TV right now and look at Southern California to see the cost when we aren't able to prevent wildfires. I would much rather spend $1 up front on investing in the health of our forests so they aren't prone to wildfire than spend $100 down the line on both response and recovery. These investments save lives and they save money. And the legislature made a commitment of $125 million a biennium to invest in that forest health and prevention work. And living up to that commitment is an issue of public safety, saving lives, saving homes, and saving money in the long run. And I'd be remiss if I didn't note that we have about 85 wildfire fighters from the Department of Natural Resources in the state of Washington, 4 strike crews, as well as equipment deployed down in Southern California right now. And the pride the Department of Natural Resources has and the people of the state of Washington ought to have in those individuals goes beyond words. We're not only leading the nation in our work here, but we're a proud partner in fighting the challenges the people of Southern California are facing.
Given that the legislature is facing a budget deficit this year, are you concerned about how that will impact agency funding or any of your plans?
Of course. Investments in the Department of Natural Resources are investments in public safety, as you noted. Our ability to prevent and fight wildfires. But we also do critical work in our geology division to prepare for earthquakes, to work with coastal communities on tsunami preparation. Public safety is a big part of the name of our game, so I was proud to hear the governor in his State of the Union talk about public safety, and our agency is one of the best ways to advance public safety in a cost-effective way. Often natural resource agencies get left behind in the broader discussions, and what I learned over the last couple of years is people in this state value recreation. They value the ability to get out and go hunting and fishing and hiking. Those are popular, essential core government programs. So, and we have a backlog of maintenance in our recreation sites. We need to be funding that maintenance backlog. We're doing some really good work to make sure we're reducing the vandalism and impacts that impact tribal cultural, the cultural resources. We need to be funding that work. And so I'm looking forward to working with the legislature to advance these popular, essential programs that the public values, but that also contribute to the well-being and economy of the state of Washington. Because at the end of the day, these are good investments.
Can we talk a little bit more about habitat conservation? You touched on that earlier, but there are various endangered species, there are various different issues that involve habitat conservation plans in Washington, and DNR, being the manager of the state lands, is at the forefront of those. What's your perspective on the pressing needs in Washington, or the ongoing, the work that continues?
Yep. We have a responsibility under the Federal Endangered Species Act to not take endangered species, not kill them. And the way that's managed is through agreements with the federal government, that if we operate in a certain way, that protects us. It gives us, if we occasionally take a species, we call those habitat conservation plans. And those are the guiding documents that help steer the management of our state-owned lands. And part of my interest in improving some of our forest management processes are because there's an element in one of those plans that calls for ensuring that we have about 10 to 15% of our forests are in a mature, structurally complex state in order to ensure we're managing for those endangered species. And I want to get there as soon as possible. But I think it's a question of responsibility. We have a responsibility under federal law. We also have a responsibility to the next generation. Imagine being the generation that lost our iconic Puget Sound orca. That's a symbol of the state of Washington. Our iconic king salmon, they're threatened on the list, our Chinook salmon. That's what makes Washington, Washington. And that's why I want to lead with strong conservation values and do it in a thoughtful way.
What would, if some of the concerns about I'm going back to the pause now.
Sure, yeah.
There were concerned stakeholders who raised issues with the idea of setting aside land that has been scheduled for harvest, as they describe it, for quite some time, and redesignating it as something else. The idea is whether that's fair to the trust beneficiaries or whether that's really the right way forward. Do you have any response to those concerns, or what would you say to people that are worried about
I think that's an interesting debate. That's not what we're doing. I haven't proposed that we set aside any lands into preservation status. I'm talking about changing our scheduling. Which parcels do we harvest when? So I'm not proposing an increase in a set aside, nor am I proposing a reduction in timber harvest. As we go through a transition, there may be some timber sales, there are some timber sales that maybe had been tentatively planned for later this year, and I'm going to replace those with different timber sales. And there will be a time lag there, and that will affect when some jurisdictions get payment. But no, I'm not proposing that we set aside lands in conservation status.
And there are around, correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
How many million acres does DNR manage?
Oh, we got a couple million acres of forest land, give or take.
And then there's some of that is, there are various plans in place for those lands, but there are available lands to replace these land.
Yes,
the harvest question.
yeah, absolutely, and we'll get a better picture of that through this work, but even a cursory review of the forest inventory data shows that in every county there's suitable timber to harvest in for the time being that would not be categorized as structurally complex mature forests.
So anytime someone's making decisions or in a position to make decisions about Washington's forests or protected species or various things, you're going to be at the crossroads of conflicting interests or at least conflicting voices here. Habitat conservation plans in the past have spawned litigation from both sides, where they're not conservative enough or they're too conservative, depending on your perspective. As you get seated in this new role, how do you prepare yourself for this type of discussion? I mean, are you ready for that at this point?
Well, maybe you're asking that because I mentioned earlier that I used to be a basketball referee. And I've discovered there's a lot of similarities between the job of the State Lands Commissioner and a basketball referee. In both cases, only you know in your heart whether you're being fair and doing the best job you can. In both cases, there are people often literally yelling at you while you're trying to do your job. And in both cases, when the game's over, you slink off the court, disappear, and everyone's mad at you. So I'm accustomed to having a thick skin. My job is to bring people together, and I think I'm going to measure my success at the end of my term by whether or not I can bring parties together around a common vision that puts us on a stable path forward, that's predictable and reliable and meets our commitment to the trust while doing better to protect the valuable habitat that our public lands provide.
So we've got a little under 2 minutes left. Could you tell me some about your background in terms of your perspective on nature, your perspective on Washington, your values?
Well, this job feels like coming home for me to what led me to public service. My whole love of the outdoors began, like a lot of people, at a young age. I spent all my summers working for the Boy Scouts, teaching environmental science out on Daybob Bay, on Hood Canal, a couple summers leading groups of kids on week-long treks to the North Cascade Mountains, and went on to get my degree in environmental science and biology. And so it was a passion for the outdoors and public service, or outdoors and nature, that led me to public service. And it's been the focus of my public service career. And so having the opportunity to lead this incredible staff at an agency that has been stewarding these lands long before I was alive and will continue to after I'm gone is really the honor of a lifetime. And it's a huge responsibility. We talked today about some of the tensions and the challenges. And I think my job as leader of this agency is to uplift the best in the staff we have, to work together with the variety of interests to find where we have common ground and advance those values: clean air, clean water, habitat, improving wildfire prevention, and expanding those recreational opportunities so kids have the opportunities like I did as a Boy Scout.
Is there anything we didn't ask that you wanted to add briefly? We've got 30 seconds or so.
My biggest takeaway as a new employee at the Department of Natural Resources is what a tremendous staff exists in that agency. The expertise on forestry, wildfire, geology makes me very proud to step in and support and serve that staff. And the public should know that these lands are in good hands, thanks to the talented staff at the Department of Natural Resources.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time, Commissioner Upthegrove. We appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Still ahead, we'll tell you about some of the bills under consideration as the legislative session moves forward. That's after the break. Stay with us.
It will dwarf Katrina. It'll be absolutely the largest thing that we will have had to have dealt with in our country. We know the clock is ticking.
We're waiting on engine 59.
The ability for us to stop all forest fires, it's just not realistic.
In week 2 of the legislative session, here are some of the bills getting attention so far. House Bill 1217 would cap annual rent increases at 7% for existing tenants and place new conditions on security deposits and late fees. House Bill 1150 would hold companies that sell products in disposable containers responsible for the packaging and require producers to help fund recycling infrastructure. Senate Bill 5274 would require the Department of Children, Youth, and Families to set up a body camera pilot project for correctional staff at the troubled Green Hill School facility. And House Bill 1340 would exempt prepared food like the kind sold at restaurants and coffee shops from sales and use tax. House Bill 1082 would postpone licensure requirements for child care workers. It's an effort to address the shortage of affordable child care in Washington. You can watch The Impact anytime online at tvw.org or listen to the podcast there. And follow us at The Impact TVW. That's all the time we have for this week. Please join us next week for more in-depth interviews you won't find anywhere else. I'm Mike McClanahan. Have a great week.